So, welcome to your end of term exam review. As you can tell, we had to do this on Canvas, and I talked about giving y'all a word bank. However, I worked on the word bank, and I worked on the word bank, and I went ahead and tried to use the word bank, and no word bank. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to do fill in the blank. Now, what I'm going to tell you is on the fill in the blank, unlike your last exam, spelling is going to be important. Context is going to be important. So what I need you to do is, if you think you got the answer right, and remember, you get 3 chances on this because and it's non-proctored, because the issue is one, for proctoring, I need to set up a proctoring system. That's kind of hard right now because everybody and their brother wants a proctored exam, and I would have had to put it in. I would have had to limit it to strictly our exam period. I want to give y'all some flexibility because some of y'all I know are taking care of aged parents, grandparents, are locked up, have lousy internet connections, are using sad internet, and sure as God made little green apples, you'll have the cloud go over right when you're fixing to hit send, and it all goes away. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to let you do it just like a quiz, and you're going to have to fill in the blank just like you normally do, but you have to make sure that you get you do it right. So if it comes back as screwed up, I want you to go back, look at the answers on the fill in the blank, and make sure you got the spelling and punctuation correct. I put as many of those in as I could, but unfortunately, when you're talking about 4 to 6 hours to load one of these tests, and I have to put in every conceivable spelling and misspelling I can think of for certain topics. So when you do that, it gets to be kind of hard. Don't intentionally use my misspellings I put in there thinking people would do it. If you see it, use the correct spelling and punctuation. So just keep that in mind as you go through. That's another reason we're not proctoring it. We're doing the 3 tests, is because I'm not a big fan of fill in the blanks on this, because I have to put in every potential correct answer, and sometimes I'm a little off. So just know that. I'm going to alibi this. I'm going to use the honor system, that if you got the answer completely out in left field wrong, that you will leave it wrong. If you were close but had a misspelling or transposed letters or something you've seen how I grade on your midterms. If you think it's something I would have given you credit for, go ahead and change it. We're going to do the honor system on this because, oh, by the way, we don't have a lot of other good options. So just cite as a note, and then let's get started on your test. Now, this is my first time going through it, since I put it on Canvas. Yeah, it was fun time. I got finished about 3 o'clock yesterday morning, and it's one of those things you wake up at 10 in the morning and it feels like 6 in the morning. So anyways, let's get started. Now, I'm not going to tell you what questions are which, but if you follow along, you can pretty much guess. And I think your first question might be something along the lines of a true-false question asking if the United States and the British Empire entered World War II at roughly the same time. Now, you all are smart people. You know that 1 September 1939 does not equal December 7th, 1941, so you're going to put false. So when we talk about World War II, you have to remember, Japan, they were being the brutal little emperor worshipping, brutal colonial power they were, making sure that the brutal colonial overlords had the right skin complexion. Here, the United States just cuts off their import of oil, scrap metal, and rubber because they were just wanting to replace the French in Indochina. What horrible people. So if you see something along the lines of Japan saw the war as necessary due to their reliance on import of oil, scrap metal, and rubber from the United States, and the militarists considered that an act of war, that's probably a true statement. So coming back from the war, World War II guys, yeah, they weren't. If you come to a question asking if they were hesitant to use our promised benefits, now they bought houses, they had college educations, they did the unemployment thing, they did it all. Now some were, but the vast majority, that would be a false. And then the United States entering or admitting Jewish refugees. Yeah, we were pretty bad about that. So if you see something, if we took forceful steps to admit Jewish refugees during World War II, afterwards we were a little different after the Holocaust became known. But during World War II, no, we were pretty bad. So if you see something asking if we took forceful steps to admit Jewish refugees, that would be false. So question 5, one social effect of the war was mass hiring of female labor, often in non-traditional roles, to replace men that were going into war, or just labor shortages before the war due to all the stuff we had to make for the Allies. Yeah, that's a true statement. So if you run into a question like that, that's definitely true. If one of the effects was mass hiring of female labor. Okay. There's a lot of opinions on how the Cold War started. I'm partial to Stalin's paranoia, but that kind of rolls into what the authors believe, which is the Cold War grew out of a failure to achieve a durable settlement among the leaders from the big three allies, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, as they met at Yalta in Russia, Crimea, and post-Stalin occupied Germany to shape the post-war order. Yeah. That's true enough. I mean, we can argue on the edges of that, but Stalin's paranoia prevented them from coming to a durable agreement. So it rolls right in. See, both those roll right in. And then Joseph Stalin, if you run into a question asking if he wanted our assistance in setting up free elections, no. That was one of the things that Roosevelt was upset about even before he died and Truman took over, was that they saw them as going back on things like repatriating German prisoners and setting up free and fair elections and government in Poland. So Stalin asking for assistance in setting up free elections is sort of like a burglar asking for assistance in setting up the victim's home security. Yeah, not so much. So just remember that on true false that if you see something about around October 1st of 1949, Mao Zedong declared China a communist people's republic following the expulsion of the nationalist Kuomintang forces from the mainland China, that'll be a true one. Also, if you're going through and you hear about Britain and the United States maintaining a nuclear monopoly until 1953, negative, Ghost Rider. They lost it in 1949, so that's a false statement. So if you read anything about on something in early 1946, say February 22nd, less than a year after the end of the war, the Charge de Affairs of the U.S. Embassy Moscow, George Kennan, sending a famously lengthy telegram, literally called the Long Telegram, denouncing the Soviet Union. That is a true statement. So you might run into another question asking that according to our text, the practice of real estate redlining, which incorporated racial and ethnic composition of neighborhoods, was one of the factors that determined mortgage risk, and a whole list of federal agencies that virtually forced banks to start this process. Yeah, that answer is true. And then, of course, if you read something, a question along the lines of the post-World War II building creating a drag on the post-war economy, due to the increasing cost of transportation because of suburbanization. Oh no, auto companies were making bank, road paving companies were making bank, builders were making bank. This doesn't sound like it was a drag on the economy at all, so I would put false. Going into that, if you get into another question that asks if all three were new deal federal programs were eliminated by 1952, no, they weren't. Social Security is a great example of that. And then the United States during the 50s did not turn against unfettered capitalism. They quite went the other way, to where they wanted the government to get, because the problem is government bureaucracies that seemed like a god with full of nice, fresh, shiny faces. That seemed like a godsend when you were a poor kid right out of high school or even in high school. By the time the 1950s roll around, those nice, fresh faces are middle-aged bureaucrats. They've lost most of their ambition, and they're acting like, well, middle-aged bureaucrats in an established bureaucracy. So, of course, people started to turn heavily against it. Plus, the fact is that as people got more economically secure, you know, and those things going after those evil rich, they realized that with the magic of inflation, compounding interest, and other factors, they were now the rich. So most people started to turn against bureaucracy and government control of the economy. And like we pointed out earlier, other than World War II, the government didn't have a very good record running the economy. So people were turning more towards unfettered capitalism. So that would be a false statement. Now, as we're going through one of the radical communication changes was television as a major source of entertainment between 1948 and 1960. Our authors will make the argument that by 1960 it was influencing presidential elections and congressional elections, so we can think that is true. And again, you know, our authors believe that one of the major factors is, and they have a point, you know, probably the margin of error between Nixon and Kennedy, other than, you know, we've talked about electoral cheating and some other stuff, but, you know, some really hokey returns in Illinois, especially from Cook County. But having said that, the Kennedy's photogenic appearance on television, Vice Nixon in his light gray suit and white shirt, which didn't very long black and white television, is definitely true. So the civil rights movement, sit-ins targeted segregation in northern states such as Ohio and Colorado, not so much. There may have been isolated places that had segregation, but they were few and far between in those places, and so much so that nobody even bothered listening. So that's false. It was mostly the South, specifically the upper and deep South. Now, one of the major turning points in the 1960s with domestic politics, foreign relations, civil rights was the assassination of John F. Kennedy by Marxist radical Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas. Yeah, that'll be true when you run into that question, if you run into that question. So we come on to one significant U.S. action in the chain of events leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis was, of course, the U.S., and by that U.S. we mean CIA, leadership sponsorship of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Like I said, people were starting to grumble about Castro, but hadn't gotten to the point that they really wanted to overthrow him. The U.S. forced the issue, which forced people to support Castro, which had bad effects later. So we can call that a true statement. So now, if you may or may not be up to question 20, which means you may or may not be 1/5 of the way done. So if you happen to come up on something that looks maybe like a question 20, and it says something to the effect that upon the assassination of Kennedy, his vice president, Richard Nixon, was inaugurated and implemented the Great Society social welfare legislation, passage of several Civil Rights Act, and introduced ground combat forces into Vietnam. False. Nixon was not in government during that time. That would be Lyndon Johnson. So now you may or may not be passing 1/5 of the way done with your course, or your test. So let's go on. According to our text, the civil rights movement at the beginning of the 1970s was very different to the more integrationist model of the early 1960s due to the rise of the Black Power movement, as well as more radical and retribution-based factions within the movement itself. That is true. Like I said, the civil rights movement was seen as a working class, middle class movement in the 50s. By the 1960s, it had become more radicalized, both due to hardcore white opposition in the South and also the rise of black separatist movements that had coalesced in earlier. So let's go on. And you might get a question to the effect that the United States military was militarily defeated in Vietnam and was forced to evacuate the country due to the Tet Offensive in 1968. Not so. After some initial reverses, they put a hammering on the Viet Cong that was almost out of the Old Testament. However, people were tired of the war, thought it was never going to end, and the North Vietnamese were more than happy to send troops down, call them Viet Cong, and continue the fight. So that would be a false statement. The United States did not leave till 1973. So we continue about, there might be a question about Woodstock and the Altamont Speedway concert in California. Were both peaceful events that demonstrate the ideals of the so-called hippie movement. What we talked about that. Altamont was an absolute disaster. A black guy got stabbed to death on the stage in front of the stage while Mick Jagger sang either "Sympathy with the Devil" or "Give Me Shelter," which nobody really knows. So at this point, yeah, we can call that false. And then you might ask, why did so many Americans sour on both the Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement? And one of the big things might be the urban riots between 1965 and 1970, where we were dumping dump trucks full of money and totally overturning the civil rights order as we've known it for nearly 100 years. And oh, by the way, all we get is cities on fire and people getting their stores burned and stuff. So, that would probably be a good reason people might turn against the Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement. And then just remember, if you come to another question, Lyndon Baines Johnson pulled out of the 1968 Democratic nomination, so he was not up for re-election in 1968. The 1968 election that Richard Milhouse Nixon won. So continuing on, just remember that if you're talking about the hardcore second wave and third wave feminists, three of the people who are not those feminists are Phyllis Schlafly, Beverly LaHaye, and Anita Bryant. They were very much the opposite and were deeply opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment and gay rights laws and socially progressive legislation imposed by conservative Christians. They were the conservative Christians. So that answer would probably be false if you run into it. Now continuing on, in 1980, Ronald Wilson Reagan did win the 1980 presidential election and beat Jimmy Carter and John Anderson to do so. So if you see a question to that effect, the answer is true. Now remember, we're talking about the Reagan Revolution, the return of conservatism. Well, as you know, much of the Democratic Party is all about co-opting various movements, like they did the populists, like they did some of the liberal Republican stuff in the 1880s, 1890s, free silver. Like I said, we can go down the list of things they've co-opted over the years. So we can, the business wing of the progressive movement, we can go down the list. So in 1985, when they formed the Democratic Leadership Council to they're actually saying that the era of big government's over. They're very pro-business. I think the term they like to use is fiscally conservative and socially liberal. So the idea that they were working with, if you see something saying they were working for Keynesian economics and organized labor, and distinct from political moderates and conservative Democrats and the business community, no, it was quite the opposite. That's who they wanted to bring back into the fold after losing the so-called Reagan Democrats. And so that would be a false. They were getting away from the labor unions and the and Keynesian big government solutions. Now, if you run into a question saying that the two big foreign policy issues that dominated the 1980 presidential campaign were the American hostages being held by Iran, most of them diplomats from the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, and the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, yeah, you're on it. That'll be true. So if you should happen to see a question, say when around the time you're 30% or maybe question 30 out of 100, asking about asking if Ronald Reagan barely defeated the Democratic candidate Walter Mondale. No, it was one of the worst landslides in electoral history. Reagan carried 49 out of 50 of the states and over 50 and close to 60% of the vote, something like 54, 55%. So, yeah, that would be false. It was a blowout, almost biblical in proportions. Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 due to economic stagnation and uncontrolled military spending, ending the Cold War. If you see a question like that, it more or less states that. That's probably a true statement. So Francis Fukuyama, remember his book was the end of history and the last Aman, which was an allusion to the fact that all the big historical debates were over. And his idea was that liberal democracy and capitalism had more or less won the day, and the socialism was dead. So if you see him predicting a question saying he's predicting the return of socialism and that free markets would fall into disrepute due to its inherent contradictions, that's false. He was quite on the opposite side of things. And he's taken unlimited grief for that ever since. So you might see a question about the first Gulf War, and it was Saddam Hussein, and who did he invade? He invaded Kuwait. So if you see a question having him invading any country besides Kuwait, it's wrong. Now, he may have threatened another country, like, say, Saudi Arabia, but he did not actually invade Saudi Arabia. So that would be a false if he says he invaded, say, Saudi Arabia. Now, you might be looking at your numbers right now and saying, gee, I'm a quarter of the way through, or I'm a third of the way through. It looks like I'm on question 34 right now. You might be right. So George H.W. Bush, or Herbert Walker Bush, was defeated in both the popular vote and in the Electoral College, mostly due to the imposition of Ross Perot, a slightly minor recession, or well, not really minor, but sharp but short recession that was going on. And Bill Clinton was, of course, this cool baby boomer, played the saxophone on Arsenio Hall, and the baby boomers just thought they should be in charge of everything, and you'd see how that worked out. But having said that, yeah, Bush lost both the popular vote and the Electoral College. So that is false. And then on September 11th, everybody knows what happened. The World Trade Center towers were destroyed by Islamic suicide attacks. So if you see something like that, it's probably true. So proximate cause, which is like the main cause that America entered World War II, I would say something having to do with December 7th and the Japanese attacks on the Philippines and other U.S. possessions in the Pacific. Yeah, that's probably what did it. I don't think they cared much about other people being invaded after your battleships are all sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. I think that was kind of enough for us to go there. And the Germans probably were an afterthought at that point. Though that would change very rapidly, where we took on a Europe first view, but that's a story for another day. So during World War II, there are several things. So if you see something about massive military expansion and the induction of unprecedented numbers of men and women, you see another answer that's like rearmament and the production of unimaginable amounts of war material. And then you hear about wartime food rationing, food, consumer goods, fuel, oil, and other numerous goods. All of that happened during World War II. So if you see it, all answers are correct to a question like that, I'd probably go with it. Notice that we've evolved from we're starting to do multiple choice now, so just keep that in mind. Same thing with President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. It had the effect of establishment of large internment camps operated by the U.S. Army to detain enemy aliens and others considered security risks in isolated areas, large numbers of enemy aliens, largely German, Italian, and Hungarian immigrants in interior camps far from urban centers, Fredericksburg, Texas, that sort of thing, and removing the entire ethnic population from the U.S. Pacific coast. That also happened. So if you see all answers are correct, I'd probably go with that one. So what was the name of the effort to develop effective nuclear weapons? Well, it was the Manhattan Project, or the Manhattan Water Project. So if I saw what was the name of the code name, was the Manhattan Project, and its cover story was doing because the Army Corps of Engineers, as you know, like we know down here, also does a lot of civilian water and waterway stuff. It was an idea that it was a combination of working on wastewater disposal and improving the ports around New York City to all conditions. It's highly top secret because it was cover story for the atomic bomb, but it was also a relatively secret project to make it so you could dock aircraft carriers in New York City. That was the cover story. And so that was the issue with it. So I would put Manhattan Project. Then, of course, you always have to remember, if somebody asks you who the main Axis powers the U.S. fought were, the main Axis powers were Japan, Germany, and Italy. There were some others, but those were the main ones. And, of course, if you talk about World War II, it almost rolls right into Korea. And what triggered the Korean conflict? This means, why did we start shooting? That would be the military invasion by North Korea of South Korea on 25th of June 1950. There are some other contributing causes, but overall the main cause is the invasion. Now, if you hear something about Berlin and how did the Allies respond, and you say something, and you see any answer besides the largest military airlift in history as measured by the duration of aircraft sorties to successfully supply the western sectors of Berlin, I'd say any other answer is probably wrong. So, as you know, Senator Joseph McCarthy is often held up to symbolize the excess of anti-communism. Her book, though, kind of gives him his due and says, however, despite Senator McCarthy's political grandstanding overreach, which damaged the reputation of the anti-communist cause, there was a legitimate communist threat to the United States and allies, with Soviet efforts directed in opposition to U.S. interests, diplomatically, military, and politically. And there were many Americans who did cooperate to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union and other communist nations. Just keep that in mind when you come to that question. So what happened if you run into a question asking what was going on besides the arms race after, say, October of 1957, we also have the space race. And so what did the U.S. National Security Council produce? It's so top secret that we read about it in history books, can peruse it at the National Archives, showing how good secret keeping is. That would be NSC, National Security Council -68, NSC -68. If you see any other answers, no, they're not. They're not the one that you're looking for. The one you're looking for begins with NSC and then it's -68. There were a lot of books published, and then you come on and going on. There's a lot of books published in the post-World War II area that were very notable. But the one that is probably most notable, that was written by John Kenneth Galbraith, of his most notable books, the one everybody remembers is called will be The Affluent Society. The other ones were all written by other people, so if you put The Affluent Society, you'll be correct. And then, of course, everybody thinks the Supreme Court didn't rule on segregation until Brown versus Board of Education. No, that was almost the capstone or the mid course of several other decisions that was beginning to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which was another screw up by the Supreme Court. We've got plenty of those. This would be the Shelley versus Kramer decision in 1946, which declared that race-based real estate covenants were both unconstitutional and legally enforceable. Of course, a musical, the soundtrack to the start of the mid-1950s to the youth culture that continued somewhat to this day, not as much as it used to, but rock and roll is kind of the soundtrack for the youth culture. So just keep that in mind. Anytime after the 1950s, youth and rock and roll go hand in hand. And then, of course, by the mid-1950s, who were marketers trying to get a hold of? Who makes most of the decisions in married couples' families on what to buy and what brand to buy? Well, that's female consumers. That's who they were targeting more than anybody else. So just keep that in mind if you go there. And oh, by the way, if you're keeping track and you've made it this far in my exam, you're almost halfway done. You might be doing question 50 right now. So let's look at question 50 and say, or maybe question 50. According to our authors, much of the cultural change towards a more individualistic culture, let's see here, the emergence of suburban and ex-urban lifestyles, well, that contributed. And libertarian authors such as Ayn Rand, well, yeah, that contributed. The expansion of evangelical Protestant Christianity among newly prosperous middle classes, of course, that contributed. You know, if you are wedded to the idea of theologically of individual salvation, why would you go to the government for your secular salvation? You're on you're captain of your own ship. Then you have the reemergence of the Austrian school. Yeah, that also had an impact. So if you see all answers are correct and those are your choices, I'd probably go with all answers are correct. Now, in the mid-1960s, you hear a lot about the Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders were more or less civil rights activists who set up in desegregated riding patterns, would get on a bus in Washington, D.C. and go all the way through the Deep South, sitting without the blacks in the back of the bus, whites in the front. No, they were all integrated in their, or desegregated in their seat patterns. People would pull over the buses, people would burn the buses, people would do dumb things. But yeah, there was the civil rights who were trying to desegregate bus transportation. Just because even the clay-brained bigots of the Ku Klux Klan aren't dumb enough to try to stop a train moving at 70 miles an hour. This usually ends badly if you're out on the track seeking that train to stop. Okay, if you see USS Maddox in 2 August 1964, what did Congress do because of that? They passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Just Just keep that in mind, and life should be good for you. And so in the 60s and early 70s, many youths went to this new type of movement. It was in support of civil rights, minority rights, a lot of recreational drug use, a lot of free sex, anti-war and activism, and a rejection of both capitalist and traditional values, as long as mom and dad kept sending money. But that was called the counterculture. Of course, you'll see a question about the missiles of October, and of course the name for the missiles of October is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you see October 1962, a nuclear confrontation between the U.S. and USSR. That's almost definitely talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, of course, our book loves intellectuals, and we have second wave feminist movement started in the late 50s, but it really got its wind in the 60s and early 70s. And one of the big works from that our authors like to credit was Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. Just keep that in mind. So according to our text, one of the things they think was driving radicalism and reaction during the second half of the 60s and early 1970s was the Vietnam War conflict. So within that, what was the driving forces that contributed to this? It contributed to the peace movement, the generation gap, and the rise of the counterculture and increasing radicalism among the young, and rejection of both capitalism and traditional values. What was really driving that? The ongoing Vietnam conflict. Our authors believe that was one of the main issues that was driving radicalism during this period. And why were young college-age men so attracted to this movement? If you get a question about that, that would be the military draft. Now, after 64 and 65, you start to see this change in the focus of the civil rights movement. What you see is it goes away from equal civil rights and everything else and starts to move towards economic justice and wealth redistribution. Even mainstream leaders who've been very associated with the middle class, and the bourgeois, like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King, started to talk like Maoists. So if you see economic justice and wealth redistribution, that became a major focus of the civil rights movement after the Voting Rights Act and the Selma engagement. So you might see a question with a lot of things that happened in 1968. One of these did not happen in 1968. Remember, an election might have happened in 1968, but if a certain president won that election, he's going to be inaugurated on January 30th of the next year. So if you see the inauguration, I say again, the inauguration of Richard Nixon as president and as a driving force, of the bad things happened in 1968, that isn't a 1968 issue. That's a 1969 issue. And then, of course, one of my favorites, and they used to play music at one time, in the 1980s, one of the most breathtaking changes on cable television was you started to have this little channel that started to get more views than the network, than the big three networks. This was called music television, or MTV. It was basically the soundtrack for Generation X in the early years, before they quit playing music and started playing stupid reality television stuff. So one of the major, in the late 80s and 90s, we see the gay liberation movement and the free gay sex movement, and the sexual permissiveness came to a screeching halt due to the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS syndrome. So anything you see about the 1981 elections, it's asking for a party and the candidate who won, you probably want to put down a Republican and Ronald Reagan. Especially if it's libertarian, social conservatives, business advocates, hard money economists, and Cold War hawks who all wanted to support one candidate. He was your guy. Now, Reagan did a lot of controversial stuff during his presidency. One of his most controversial was the Star Wars missile defense system. Some of it worked out well. Some of it never got it worked out because it was very expensive, but that was his big thing. Now, for diplomatic things, the biggest one for him was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. You probably see a couple big accomplishments that are linked to Reagan, but he was not in office when any of these other three actually happened. So, the negotiations for the release of hostages were completed before he was inaugurated. Manuel Noriega went from Panamanian dictator to Miami prison inmate due to, that was after he left office. And the fall of the Berlin Wall, October of 1989, he left office in January 1989. So when Bill Clinton came along, he was running as a New Democrat. Just remember that. Bill Clinton was running as a New Democrat. And now if you're keeping track, we're probably up to question 67 if this happens to be the exam. So you're going to be thinking, I'm 2/3 of the way done. Wow. So the North American Free Trade Agreement was submitted and ratified during the presidential administration of William J. Bill Clinton. Just keep that in mind. It was not Bush and it was not Obama. Either of the Bushes, to be honest. So within weeks, now remember, the key is within weeks of the 9/11 attacks, we were fighting a war in Afghanistan. Which, oh, by the way, we're still fighting a war in Afghanistan. So Iraq didn't happen until almost a year and a half later. And then, of course, with regard to the Afghanistan in 2000, a lot longer than a few weeks after the 9/11 attack. You have to remember, the U.S. has really been in a state of war and near war with Iraq since the conclusion of the Gulf War in 1991. You had Desert Fox and a bunch of other big operations. And Bill Clinton had actually made a U.S. policy to defeat and remove from power Saddam Hussein. So come along. We have George W. Bush. He's popular for the first. He barely makes election. Very controversial issue. Florida was in the middle of it, hanging chads. He does okay his first few years, and then a bunch of events outside of his control, well, some in his control, some outside of his control, come along. And oh, by the way, one of the big ones at the end of his thing was the crash of 2008. John McCain didn't react well to that, suspended his presidential campaign, so we get President Barack Hussein Obama out of the deal. So the recession of 2008 is one of the big things that facilitated Senator Barack Obama's victory over Senator John McCain. Now, you probably noticed that if you've answered all the questions correctly at this point, congratulations, you just passed the test because you just got a 70. Now we're going to get into the fill in the blanks, and this is where it gets tricky. Like I said, I tried a word bank, didn't work. The word bank ended up screwing up like a big dog. It was ugly. It got to be self-aware. Yeah, I wasn't going to release that on the world. I had to delete it twice before it would have to take, and it made it that I got my 2.5 or 3.5 hours of taking a written exam and putting it on Canvas, and got it complete in only 6 hours. Now, one thing here is this is the part I told you about at the beginning. You're beginning to do fill in the blank where you type in the blank. And then, so what you do is you have to spell things correctly, and if it's a proper noun, like say, coming on the first one, the United States supported the British Empire led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. You have to go capital BRITISH and load that one in. And like I said, I put some variations in there. I think I have like 8 to 12 on most of these. And then President, and then you can get away with last name, ROSVELT. Make sure you capitalize ROSEVELT. Capital R, O, 2 O's, SEVELT. Okay? On September 22nd, 1945, the last Axis power to surrender, I would put down Japan, and I would spell it correctly. Capital JAPAN. And then, like I said, you only have to do the last name, although I will accept Harry S., and so on. I put all those in. But all you have to do, if you come to a question, say number 74, that upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt, all you have to put is TRUMAN, and make sure you capitalize the T, prop down, and it's a guy's name. 2 reasons you need to capitalize. Same with question 75. I don't know how you'll misspell this. One of the major foreign policy incidents that damaged the Truman administration was the fall of mainland, and that should be your cue to put in a name. It's definitely a country that starts with a capital CHINA, China. Our flu bros, the ones who give us nice new viral infections that make us have to do this all online. Another policy challenge for the Truman administration, if somebody asks about some conflict that was endorsed by the United Nations and resulted in 33,000 U.S. casualties, some peninsula, I would call it the Korean, capital KOREAN, peninsula. And then the former supreme commander in Europe during World War II ran for the presidency in 1952, promised to end the Korean conflict, and then led the unprecedented prosperity and left office in January '61. Richard Nixon as vice president didn't win the election, even though he's popular. It's Eisenhower, EISENHOWER, and make sure the E is capital. The first E is capitalized. Or I'll say Dwight Eisenhower, Dwight David Eisenhower, even Ike, IKE will work in this. Trust me, I had to load all those at 2 in the morning. I know it'll work. So, during the 1950s, the conflict rivalry between the Soviet Union and its allies, the United States, was known as and then it's in parentheses, so you don't have to put it in parentheses, Cold War, capital COLD, and space, capital WAR, Cold War. And then, again, this one has like 30, the next one will be Democratic Massachusetts Senator defeated Vice President Richard Nixon. Goes on to talk about paying any price, bearing any burden, and being assassinated on 22 November 1963. That's President John F. Kennedy. So there's a lot of variations. I'll take JFK. I'll take a lot of things. But the main one, the easy way to do it is capital KENNEDY. And that'll work for this exercise. So President Kennedy faced several foreign challenges during his presidency: the Vienna Summit, the Berlin Wall, the escalating Vietnam conflict, but his greatest problems were very close to home. And that close to home is spelled C-U-B-A, capital C-U-B-A, Cuba. So if you notice now, if you got everything right at this point, you just got to be on the test. Isn't this cool? So let's go on. Who was Kennedy's vice president? Well, he had a lot of names: LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon's Lyndon B. Johnson. But if you just put Johnson, and I spell capital Johnsson, that should be sufficient for our purposes here. If you want to go for the gusto and try something else, it should work. If it doesn't, I told you the trick. Do a grade on your own test, and I'm going to trust your judgment. If you just had no shit, hit the wrong key, hey, fix it. If it's something you legitimately did not know and were completely lost in the sauce, I expect you to leave it incorrect when you retake the test. Okay, what did Johnson, despite wanting to focus on domestic policy, social welfare, and civil rights, what did he came to be defined by? We just talked about that with the youth. Vietnam conflict. Vietnam. Capital Vietnam. So, 1968 presidential election, elected Republican candidate Richard Milhouse Nixon. That goes into the description about him and having to leave for Watergate in 1974, which you probably know from our presidential challenge, which wasn't much of a challenge because I had to do the whole thing. But having said that, let's just try Nixon. Capital Nixon. So a major event that weakened Nixon's domestic standing in late 1963 was the oil embargo. Capital OIL EMBARGO. And then, of course, former Michigan football star, World War II naval officer, House Minority Leader, President Gerald Ford. You could just put, or Vice President Gerald Ford. We can just try capital F-O-R-D, like the car. That's who made the pinup. Now you get to question 86, and they ask what inhibited his popularity. Was the rise of economic and monetary inflation. Capital INFLATION. Inflation. Now question 87. Like I said, Jimmy Carter, James Earl Carter, James Earl Jimmy Carter, all of those work. But you can just put C-A-T-E-R, capital C-A-R-T-E-R. C-A-R-T-E-R, capital C-A-R-T-E-R. Carter, that should work. So we get to question 88. What is this? You can call it Iran or Iranian. Either one works. So we'll go with Iran, capital I-R-A-N. So question 89, we talked about the election of 1980. That was Ronald Wilson Reagan, but we can just put R-E-A-G-A-N, and that should work. Capital R-E-A-G-A-N. R-E-A-G-A-N. Reagan was his Treasury Secretary, Chief of Staff. So we talk about one of President Reagan's major domestic accomplishments was the taming of America's chronic economic blank. And guess what this is again? Capital I-N-F-L-A-T-I-O-N, inflation. And you notice that if you got everything right to this point, congratulations, you just got a 90%. So here we have who replaced him. It was his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, or George H.W. Bush. That sounds like 16 entries. But if you just put capital B-U-S-H, you're good. So, what treaty did H. Ross Perot oppose that caused the split and caused him to lose a lot of the Reagan Democrats that didn't vote for Bill Clinton and voted for him instead? That was a NAFTA treaty. Remember, this is going to be all capitalized because it's the North American Free Trade Agreement. You can spell it out if you wish, but an easy way to do it is capital N, capital T, A, capital T, capital F, capital A. And that should work. Capital, just say again, capital N, capital A, capital F, capital T, capital A, North American Free Trade Agreement. And then, of course, 92, we talked about Bill Clinton already. So we are going to spell it, capital C, and then L-I-T-O-N. I say again, capital C, capital L, capital I, capital N, capital T. No, correction. Erase all. Capital C, L-I-N-T-O-N. Okay, some skeletons came out of his closet, and we hear our old friend again from the 60s, Vietnam. Capital V-I-E-T-N-A-M. Then we come into W, or Bush Jr., popular Republican governor of Texas, on and on, president during the 9/11 attacks, again, capital B-U-S-H. So what was Bush unpopular for? A lot of things, but what do civil libertarians really hate him for to this day? Was something called the Patriot Act. So if you decide to answer the blank act and you want to put Patriot, you put capital P-A-T-R-I-O-T. And then, of course, we come to our next president, the nation's first black president, Barack Obama, Barack Hussein Obama, but for our purposes, we can just check the box by going O-B-A-M-A, Obama. So, one criticism of him, because, he passed Obamacare, which was very expensive and didn't do anything to really fix the healthcare problems. As a matter of fact, it ran a bunch of doubled everybody's health care premiums and drove a bunch of independent practitioners out of business, which, oh, by the way, jacked up prices even more. He was unpopular. So what happened with him pushing it through, did some pretty hokey stuff, he lost control of Congress. So he had to rely on executive orders. So if you see a plethora of executive blank, that'll be orders, capital O-R-D-E-R-S. And then, of course, we come to President Florida Man. We all know who the current president is. It's Trump, capital T-R-U-M-P. Donald Trump, Donald J. Trump, Donald John Trump, these all work. And so who's the people that civil libertarians are worried about? The outside role of intelligence agencies, judiciary, and the federal bureaucracy. Opposing the Trump administration through ethically and legally and morally dubious means. Within the stable, unelected permanent officials is often derisively known as the deep state. Now it'll be capital F. Now, so if you see that, parentheses, capital S-T-A-T-E. Okay, we're getting, now for some reason it's counting our bonus questions as additional questions. I don't know how to fix that. I'll figure it out by the exam. But if you see a question 101, that's bonus question 1. Now we're talking about what city got plastered. That's Hiroshima. That's capital H-I-R-O-S-H-I-M-A. Second wartime use in the first plutonium bomb was, of course, then instead of using uranium, what was different about the bomb that hit Nagasaki? It used plutonium, capital P-L-U-T-O-N-U-M. Plutonium, P-L-U-T-O-N-I-U-M. I feel like I'm in a spelling bee right now. Question number 3, long-range heavy bomber, that was the B-29, or the Super Fortress. So you can spell Super Fortress or some variation of B-29. Here you can just put -29, and that should work because I already gave you the spotted you the B. So foreign policy issue, we saw the Cold War turn hot. Again, we see our famous date, 25 June 1950, so that's Korea, K-O-R-E-A. It'll also be Republic of Korea, South Korea, all those will work. And question 5. If the 52 American hostages seized by student radicals 4 November 1979 was the Iran or Iranian hostage crisis, capital I-R-A-N. So we'll see how we did. Looks like we did pretty good. Okay, one alibi besides Cold War, another one that works for question 78 is also the arms race or military arms race. So for question 78, during the 1950s, a conflict rivalry between the Soviet Union and its allies was known as the blank, which resulted in increased baseline military spending and the emergence of, in the words of President Eisenhower, a military-industrial complex. I said Cold War. The better answer, even though Cold War will work, is the arms race or military arms race, and that's spelled A, capital A-R-M-S, space, capital R-A-C-E. Because I did put Cold War as a correct answer, but realistically, I would rather use arms race. I may take Cold War off as a correct answer on that one, even though that's the one I put down for this. So that pretty much concludes your review. Contact me with any questions, and I look forward to talking to you all tomorrow when we do our Zoom session. For the time being, this is Professor Kaserman, out.